Greetings to my friends at Boulder Bookstore in beautiful Colorado. I am here in beautiful Connecticut. You can see behind me, I'm on the water and it is a cold winter day and it's absolutely beautiful. And I'm so happy to be with you here today. My name is Deborah Goodrich Royce and I am a novelist. I write thrillers and my latest, Reef Road, here is a galley because the book hasn't come out quite yet when I'm talking to you. Comes out on January the 10th, 2023, and I am so excited to share it with all of you from Boulder Bookstore here today. So Reef Road, like all my thrillers, is an examination of identity, of the secrets that people keep. It is a dual narrative that takes place in Palm Beach, Florida, where there really is a street called Reef Road, and I just love that name. Doesn't it sound like sort of a dangerous, perilous place? So in Palm Beach, Florida, in the spring of 2020, we all know what was happening. It was the COVID lockdown. There are two women who come to our attention in the book. One is a lonely writer, a middle-aged writer who's obsessed with the murder of her mother's best friend and is tracking it and researching it. And there is another storyline, and those chapters are simply called The Wife, and it is like a novel within a novel. And it is the life of a woman named Linda Alonso, I love her name, who's married to a very handsome fellow from Argentina named Miguel Alonso. And several weeks into the pandemic lockdown, he is last seen getting on a plane at Miami International Airport in his face mask, accompanied by their two children, headed for Buenos Aires. And because of the COVID lockdown, his wife cannot follow. So you spend the rest of the book trying to figure out what on earth the writer has to do with the wife and how these stories intersect. And believe me, they do and they will. There were a few inspirations for this book. First and foremost, my own mother's best friend was murdered in Pittsburgh in December of 1948. My mother was 12, her friend was 12, and it was a savage murder that happened at home, and my mother was supposed to have been at the girl's house that night. Through a series of circumstances, my mother was not there. The parents came home to discover their little girl nearly dead, not quite yet. She died later that night in the hospital, and it has remained an unsolved crime. Now, in 2023, it will be 75 years. It's a very long time. So I've always known about this murder. I've always known about the effect it had on my mother. It made her very fearful at home. It made her feel that, intruders could come into the house. And when the lockdown happened, I began the research into all the vast amounts of material that are available on the internet now. And of course, I'm a fiction writer, and I decided to take the facts of the story of this real murder and embed them in a fictitious story. Now, why did I do that? Well, mostly I wanted to get to the essential truth of what I was trying to examine, which is the tangential effect of violence on people who are not the victim. And any of you out there who have had terrible things happen to people you know, it has an effect on you, not just on that person. I mean, think about Dominic Dunn and his daughter who was murdered in 1984 in Los Angeles. He then completely changed his life around and became this chronicler for Vanity Fair magazine of, in his case, high-profile murder trials. Or you think about Michelle McNamara, who was very instrumental through her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, with solving the case of the Golden State Killer, also in California. And she had grown up in Illinois, where a girl was murdered very near to her house. So I'm intrigued by that syndrome. It was very well explored by Dennis Lehane in the book Mystic River and the following movie. So it's not unique to me. I am also intrigued by generational trauma, and I've done a tremendous amount of research into that. And there's a book out now, which you should order through Boulder Bookstore, called It Didn't Start With You. And it's about a fascinating topic called epigenetics, which it not only do we pass down trauma that we know about. For example, I know my mother's best friend was murdered. I know the story. I know much more about it now than I ever did when I was younger. And so I have certain things that I think about or ways that I behave because I know about it. But it is strangely also true about things you don't know. So for example, they did experiments on mice where they took a generation of mice and they exposed them to a particular smell and then gave them shocks. 2 generations later, so the grandchildren of those mice, and obviously, as much as we know, the mice are not telling stories to each other, if their grandchildren were exposed to that exact smell, they had reactions of stress and anxiety. So that is epigenetics. So I'm deeply interested in that. And that plays into this book because I'm posing questions of, can we outrun the past? Is there sort of this, sins of the father stain that sits on us? And if you look at epigenetics, it also gets into concepts of cultural trauma, the genocide of the Native Americans, the enslavement of people who came from Africa. What does that do in generations going forward? I don't explore all of that in this book, and that's where fiction comes in awfully handy, because you can take concepts and funnel them into a story and look at it from that point of view. So one of the questions that I was asked by Boulder Bookstore is, why did I set this book in the pandemic? And I was writing it during the pandemic, so it was kind of a day and date, almost like writing history as it was happening. We were in this lockdown, and when you're in the middle of something, you certainly don't know where it's going to go. If you recall, it was supposed to be 2 weeks that we were locked down. So as I was writing it, I realized that the pandemic was the perfect setting for this story because it imposed natural limitations on the characters. You always have to limit in fiction. Alice McDermott talks about that. She talks about when you write nonfiction, the story already exists. The story is the story. So you're basically delivering it in a reporting fashion. In fiction, it could be anything. The sky's the limit. It could go anywhere the writer wants it to go. So the author is choosing walls around it. And talk about walls. We had some very well-defined walls in the spring of 2020. So another question I was asked by the Boulder Bookstore was, have my writing habits changed over the years? I'm going to have a little sip of my coffee. And I would say yes. So I'm really almost a decade into writing with discipline and practice. And when I first began, I was an adult, I was changing my life, I was reorganizing my life. So like many of you, I had to figure out how to restructure it. So one of the things I did is I would work with my trusty iPhone or my computer and block out times, again, those constraints. And I would always choose like a 3 to 6 hour window. I have to write in the day. I'm not a nighttime writer. I can't do that. So by the time the pandemic came along, I had endless stretches of time. So I think It hurried me along to book 3 faster than I might have gotten to book 3. At that moment, when we were first locked down, I was still on a book tour for Finding Mrs. Ford. We were about a year from releasing Ruby Falls, and Reef Road didn't exist yet. So I would say, a lot of catch-up time where I was able to move forward, which was helpful. So another terrific question is, what are some of the things I've been reading since this has all happened? So I'm going to hold up, if you've ever heard me talk, you've heard me talk about this book a million times. This is my comfort book, Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. Really, Pursuit of Love is my favorite, by Nancy Mitford. These books track an English family, really in the period between the 2 world wars and through World War II. And why is this a comfort book? It takes a big, raucous, messy family, loosely based on Mitford's own family, and puts them, again, in a wartime setting or a between the wars setting, and treats it with pathos and humor, the way the people cope and relate to one another. So this is an all-time favorite. I mentioned Alice McDermott, and I'm very immersed in this book on writing now. What about the baby? And the question, of course, refers to like the gun. Who was it, Tolstoy or Chekhov said, if you introduce a gun at the beginning, the gun has to appear. So if readers see a baby in a carriage and they don't see that baby again, they're going to wonder, what about the baby? And then this book, Flight, by Lynn Steger Strong, has just completely captivated me. It's still before Christmas when I'm recording this. It is a book that takes place when a group of adult children, their spouses and their families gather for the first Christmas after their mother has died. And I have a big blended family. My husband and I have 6 children, 6 grandchildren, spouses, all this stuff. So as a mother, grandmother, you always want them. You have this idea that your children and your grandchildren will be linked forever. And this wonderful book, Flight, in this novel, she really goes very far down this wonderful rabbit hole of what these siblings think of each other, and a crisis occurs, and of course it catapults everybody into deeper levels of thinking about each other. So I'm going to read a little bit of Reef Road, and I'm going to keep it short, and then we will say goodbye after that. So I'm starting in the writer's section. So this is chapter 1, A Writer's Thoughts. When I look at photographs of Noelle, I try to gauge her expression for signs of what was to come. There are 2 pictures of her in newspapers, though neither is dated. In one, her hair is parted slightly off-center and piled atop her head in a Fraulein-style braid. I can't tell if 1 or 2 braids were plaited to wrap across the crown of her head, but the effect suggests a little German girl in the years before the war. Noelle's chin in this particular image is dipped down. Her eyes look up to the camera, and her smile is slight, lips barely parted. Because the photos I am studying are taken from old newspapers from the weeks and months, even years after it happened, the pictures are grainy and pixelated. The upward regard of her gaze allows the whites of her eyes to show underneath the irises, thus lending her an expression that the Japanese, or maybe it is only the macrobiotic practitioners, would call sanpaku. George Osawa, founder of the macrobiotic movement in post-war Japan, identified this characteristic, the whites of the eyes being visible either above or below the irises from the position of a straightforward look, as a sign of extreme ill health or imbalance, which he attributed to the worsening diets of his countrymen through the influence of Western culture. This trait, he believed, was an indicator of those marked for death, and has been noted by other macrobiotics, I know this because I used to be one, in the gazes of a gamut of doomed historical figures, ranging from Rasputin to Marilyn Monroe to Charles Manson. All of them, we can safely agree, qualified as marked for death, although death in Manson's case did not happen to be his own. Ironically, in the photo of Noelle in question, she is looking up at the camera, not straight ahead of her, so she cannot really be called San Pacu at all, though marked for death she was. In the other photograph that was used by the papers, Noelle is also looking upward, but not in the direction of the camera. She casts her eyes up and to the side, as if to the corner of the room, to an object she sees that is invisible to the rest of us. An angel, I hope. Something good and hopeful and reassuring, that her last moments on earth, as horrific as they would be, offered reprieve. Noelle's smile is bigger in this picture. I think I even see dimples in her cheeks, but she is still not fully open to us. She holds something in reserve. This image of Noelle, however, reveals the girl my mother remembered. She, my mother, did not recognize her childhood friend in the braided girl who resembled a little Greta or Heidi, but she looked at this image and said this was the Noelle she knew, the girl with whom she rode the streetcar, went to school, walked to Frick Park, and of course played. They were children after all. So I will stop there. I hope you enjoy Reef Road. I hope you find things to think about and talk about. If you ever want me to visit your book club by Zoom or in person, I will. And thank you so much to Boulder Bookstore. I'm so happy to be with you, and I look forward to coming back.